across the board, you've been seeing I think an overall sense of people being aware that almost every media house is to some extent or the other compromised.
The news media in South Africa and internationally is under enormous financial and operational pressure. This is mostly due to the wave of digital disruption, which has shaken the very foundations of the industry. How do we gain access to credible and trustworthy sources of information in this environment? Well, joining me to discuss is Kanthan Pillay. He is a longtime media practitioner with many decades of experience. Kanthan Pillay, welcome to the show.
Thanks, David. Good to be here.
So, Kanthan, how did you get involved in the media? What drew you to the profession?
Well, when I was a kid, I used to read Superman comics. And, this idea of seeing myself as a Clark Kent type of person who would, leap into a phone booth and then suddenly go out and solve the problems of the world. And that seriously is where it started when, I was in primary school. But I ended up in media by accident because I had gone to the University of Durban-Westville to do a BSc with a view to becoming a doctor. And I got expelled from the University of Durban-Westville in 1980. And I found myself on the streets with, it was student activism, by the way, that got me expelled back then during the class boycotts of 1980. And I found myself with not much to do. And I ended up in the newsroom of Post newspaper in Durban, where there was a journalist named Farouk Khan, who took a group of us youngsters under his wing and taught us the basics of journalism. And everything kind of spiraled from there. So I ended up falling into journalism by accident. Left the country with a state of emergency in 1986. And ended up with a scholarship to Princeton. So I went and did my undergraduate out there. Ended up falling into computer science and ended up setting up a research center on the island of Sardinia, but came back to the country in 1994, rejoined the media business, but on the technology side to basically introduce all of the new tech that I'd developed experience with while working in the US. So that was independent newspapers at the time. They were still the Argus company back then. And I ripped out their aging mainframes and replaced it with desktop publishing systems. So we were the first people to bring Apple Macintosh computers on a large scale into the country. And moved from there to the business management side of things. So I was new enterprises manager for independent newspapers based in Johannesburg. We launched a bunch of new products. So we launched magazines going into the soccer business. We bought out Pent-Up Publications, which used to produce things like The Cut and a bunch of cool magazines. And I took the group into radio. And we were about to make a fairly significant drive into the community newspaper market when we got slapped with the restraint of trade by Caxton newspapers, which meant that entire plan that I'd had for democratization of the media kind of fell apart. I'll tell you about it very briefly because it was an interesting business model. The idea was to actually partner with local communities and get them to set up individual publications, knock and drops basically, free sheet publications, in partnership with independent newspapers. And the idea is they would have a 51% stake, we would have a 49% stake, but we would be able to get this entire network of community newspapers off the ground based on the fact that the independent group would be able to sell advertising at a national level, which would then, a proportional share of revenue would then filter down into these publications to enable them to sustain themselves. Obviously, we had access to the printing presses, so we'd be able to absorb a significant chunk of those costs. And hopefully, the end of the process, we'd have a fairly distributed and democratized media structure, but at the same time making money, which, the two crucial things that you need. But Caxton, as I said, slapped us with a restraint of trade, which actually went back to a gentleman's agreement that had taken place during the apartheid era. And so we basically got the rug pulled out from under us. So I ended up going back into mainstream newspapers, was managing editor of the Cape Times for a couple of years, from 97 to 99. Paper turned a profit for the first time in 15 years during that time. And then in 99, I went and joined the startup team of ETV. So there was a couple of frantic years out there. 9/11 happened during that time, at which time I was given responsibility for ETV News. And we very quickly grew that from being a kind of straggler against the SABC to more than double SABC's audience by the time I ended up leaving. And that's kind of the broad brushstrokes. I ran radio station YFM for 10 years. And I do lots of other bits and pieces in the media right now. But that's kind of the scope, from the Clark Kent scenario to pretty much where we are now.
Okay. And I also think it's interesting that you were involved in print journalism and broadcast journalism. And I think what's striking about your career is that you were an early adopter of some of the digital technologies that have vastly enhanced and widened the scope of media production, but have also created some headwinds for the industry in terms of revenues. And we'll get into the financial conversation in just a moment. But how have you seen the South African media landscape changing over the period of your career, Kanthan? Because, I think if we survey the media landscape at the moment, I see ETV, your alma mater, has just announced some significant retrenchments. And that's a familiar story across many media houses. Newsrooms are getting smaller and juniorized as well. So what are some of the trends that you've observed?
Look, let's actually just go back to, kind of the 94 period, which is when I pitched up again in the country. And if you look at the time, the Argus company, which I rejoined, was a fairly solid, well, actually, there were two fairly solid and dependable newspaper groups in the country at the time. So the Argus company was one of them, and the Argus company pretty much owned the market for the afternoon newspapers. So at that time, the Star used to be an afternoon paper. And there was the Daily News in Durban and the Argus in Cape Town. And the other large group was SA Associated Newspapers, which became Times Media Limited, which became Avusa, which became, I forget what the guys are called these days, but they generally handled what was called the morning group of newspapers. So it was the Cape Times, there was the Eastern Province Herald, there was the Mercury in Durban, and of course, a couple of decades before, there was the Rand Daily Mail, and the Rand Daily Mail had been shut down, and the supplement of the Rand Daily Mail, which was Business Day, then became the mainstream paper. And there was trade-offs that took place with the government at the time. But the fact of the matter is that in 1994, we had a very solid and dependable print media structure in the country. Look, I mean, the Afrikaans press, for that matter, titles like Report and Beeld and Die Burger were also rock solid publications, all, quite dependable. Obviously, they all had their own political allegiances to some extent, but by and large, the groups at the time stuck to the basics of journalism. And one could generally trust the type of reporting that was coming out. So we didn't really see disinformation. You would see censorship by omission, which is, every publication in the world does that in terms of the choices that you make around what you choose to cover. But the type of reporting that you would end up getting was solid because you had journalists who were well trained, they were well mentored within the newsroom. Then we had Tony O'Reilly from Independent Newspapers UK, who then pitched up and bought out the Argus company. And he bought it at as I recall at the time, for the princely sum of 80 million rand. And his business model, basically, in almost every business that he had been in, was to cost cut. So, for example, he used to run Heinz ketchup years before. And the way in which he very quickly upped the profitability of Heinz ketchup was by removing the label from the back of the bottle, which meant that there was significant cost savings that were incurred. And all of the stuff that was previously printed on the back of the bottle label, he now printed on the inside of the front bottle label. So, you'd have to drink your way through the bottle of ketchup before you could see what it was. But that was essentially his business model, cost-cutting things to profitability. And he brought that business model into the newspaper business. And that actually started a trend that persists to this day, where essentially what you do is every time you lose a high-cost asset, and in this case, a high-cost asset would be a valuable journalist, you don't replace that person at the same level, you replace that person at a vastly junior level. And so you've had this constant dumbing down of content that has happened over the time. But the overall impact of that has been that because there's a dumbing down of content, you also have a fall in terms of credibility of the medium. Because there's a fall in credibility of the media, fewer people are buying it. And because fewer people are buying it, the advertising revenue goes down. And because the advertising revenue goes down, they get into cost cutting yet again. And so it's kind of lather, rinse, repeat. And that has pretty much been the process ever since we became a free country in 1994. So now take that exactly the same business model and now apply it to almost every other institution that used to be responsible for producing news. Of course, the SABC has always been the biggest of the lot, but SABC, through years of chronic mismanagement, where you've essentially depleted resources that would go into producing actual content, and rather redistributed that into resources that effectively went into enriching executives. And, we know the story around, how all of that occurred. So the SABC, which really should have been the BBC of Africa, ended up pretty much constantly degrading its own resources. The thing that you mentioned right now in terms of ETV, actually ETV by itself is still doing extremely well. It's ENCA that has taken a bit of a pounding. And the reason why ENCA has taken a pounding, if you take a look at the broad brushstrokes, is because DSTV, which is essentially responsible for carrying ENCA, has been hemorrhaging subscribers for quite a while. And so correspondingly with those hemorrhaging of those subscribers, particularly at the upper end of the market, because remember that ENCA was a premium channel, which meant that you had to be on the highest tier to get that. Now, what we've had is, because of competition from the likes of, we've got Netflix, we've got Amazon Prime, we've got Apple TV, we've now got Disney Plus coming into the country as well. The fact is that you can actually subscribe to all of those at the same time for a lower price than paying for a DSTV premium subscription. So it's unsurprising that you've had this net depletion of resources that has gone into the media.
Okay, so those are some of the financial pressures, but there's also been a brain drain in the media where skilled senior practitioners have left the profession to join PR firms or advertising agencies or to work with government, for example. How is that affecting the industry?
Well, I think you've nailed it. That's actually a significant chunk, because you consider what the average salary is right now and let's hone in on the print media right now, because broadcast is a different category. My understanding is that the current salary for an editor in the independent media group is now down to less than 500,000 Rand a year. Consider that is significantly lower down from where it was in the pre-COVID era, at which time it was sitting at around about 1 million. So effectively, I think the editors have taken roughly a 50% cut and pay, and that's money that's not going to go back. Now, that's the type of money that you could effortlessly double by going into the private sector in a PR capacity. And in fact, one of the biggest sources of the brain drain of intellectual capital from the media has not been into the private sector. It has actually been particularly Black journalists who've been taken from the media and put into government, because government, of course, doesn't have to make a profit, and they can afford to pay massively inflated salaries. So if you happen to be what they refer to as an MLA, Ministerial Liaison Officer, you will effectively make up about 4 to 5 times as much money as you'll be making as a newspaper editor. So why on earth would you want to be sweating bullets working in an industry that's basically on a downward spiral in terms of revenue, when you could be hopping across and earning far more money? So yes, public relations has been a big source of the drain, but public relations has generally pulled among the most competent people from journalism. Whereas if you look in terms of the people who've gone into government, they've generally just been because of the fact that government wants to have press people who are able to issue statements for them and that type of thing. Some of them have been good over the years, and others of them have been, shall we say, less than helpful in terms of actually giving us a picture of what goes on in government. But right now, what you have in terms of the media has been rampant juniorization. So I think if you take a look at what's happened at ENCA over the past period, probably it's the most senior people who ended up getting the chop. And look, frankly, you can't really blame them for that, because they have to work within the cost structure and still keep a 24-hour news channel on air. And so, if the overall amount of revenue that DSTV is generating goes down, you are going to see a corresponding fall in terms of quality. Let me just actually ask you at this point, do you think, based on the stuff that I'm telling you, whether there's any hope for this business?
So when I survey the landscape, I'm not particularly optimistic about the fate of the traditional media, but in terms of new media, I'm pretty bullish.
I'm pretty bullish about new media as well, which is why I try and do as many of these types of engagements as I possibly can, because I think that they're a hugely important contributor to people being able to have a better understanding of what goes on in the world. Crucial thing, though, is that small operations, no matter how diverse, are never going to be able to sustain a type of prolonged investigation that's actually required to do really proper journalism. And that ends up taking time, and it ends up taking money. So to pull an investigative team together, it means that a team of investigative journalists are effectively going to be not doing any day-to-day work for the media house concerned until that story is actually fully packaged and comes together. And you might well end up with a situation where the investigation actually goes toes up and there's no story at the end of it. But it's an expensive process, and you have to keep at it. And eventually, when you do get that breakthrough story of rampant corruption or the drug deals that have been going down in particular communities, which have required you to go underground and do all of that research, these are all significant and important stories for the world, really speaking. And unless you have people who are able to invest money into that type of thing, it's really difficult to pull it off. So the choices that you then have is that you either have patrons, which means that you're always beholden to the patrons. So, you take the case of the Wall Street Journal right now. It's very clear that the Wall Street Journal is going to in some way follow the agenda of its owner, irrespective of whether or not it ends up making money. Because in order to stay in business, it needs to actually have that big brother behind the scenes that's pushing money across in its direction.
Washington Post also has Jeff Bezos behind the scenes, providing generous financial support.
Another good example. You're seeing this as a pattern that's happening, pretty much all around the world. I mean, look, Murdoch's reign in of itself, if you consider the massive empire that he single-handedly controls in terms of the media landscape, absolutely huge. So the opportunity that you might potentially have for a newspaper to start making money, and I like to start with newspapers because it's a very clean business model, because people will only put down their money for the publication if they have a vested interest in doing so, which is very different to the scenario where you might flip on a TV or not. Would you pay for a subscription to a broadcast TV channel specifically? I don't know the answer to that yet, because I think by and large people are so used to getting things for nothing on television that they'd be very disinclined to do so. But if I use newspapers very specifically as a business model, if you did have a scenario where people were willing to put down on a regular basis enough money to cover the cost of publication of the newspaper, and so again, let me put this in perspective. If you want to produce a broadsheet newspaper today, the cost of the publication of the newspaper would be, I would say, roughly about, in today's money, probably roughly about 20 cents per broadsheet page. Okay, so let me just pull out my calculator very quickly. So it's basically 20 cents times 24 pages. So your basic cost is around about 5 Rand just for the printing costs that go into a 24-page paper. So now, on the assumption that you've got a basic cost of 5 Rand to print a 24-page paper, assuming you are selling 20,000 copies per day, which immediately means that you're looking at print costs of 100,000 per day just to get out that publication if you're selling 20,000 copies. If you're selling 30,000 copies, you're looking at 150,000 per day. And of course, every one of those copies that ends up not getting sold means that you've ended up losing money. But yeah, so a minimum of 100,000 per day, 500,000 per week, 2 million Rand a month, 24 million Rand a year. And that's before that, just on the assumption that not a single cent of money has now come in terms of your basic revenues. So you start off with that amount of cost. Then there's the distribution costs that go into it as well. And so eventually, when you get to the point where it lands in the hands of the person who's actually buying it, unless they're prepared to say upfront, I'm going to be spending, what would you pay for a Starbucks coffee these days? About $25 at least. You see, if people are willing to make that mental shift and say that I'm willing to put down the cost of a cup of coffee every single day in order to actually get something into my hands that's dependable, then you are going to have a business model that actually works. Now, how do we know this? It's because there are parts of the world where it actually does work. So Hong Kong, for example, has absolutely thriving newspaper market. There are multiple titles in multiple languages. Every single one of them sells. They're all profitable. Obviously now with Beijing exhibiting far more control, there's much more of a crackdown, and you're seeing a corresponding fallback in terms of credibility. But take Hong Kong as a very good example. India is a massive example in terms of the number of newspapers that they sustain, because they've got the numbers. We would probably have been in that situation in our country if not for the fact that you've had this asset stripping taking place without having sound business management to say that we actually need to focus on ensuring that our content is something that people requires on a day-to-day basis, and more importantly, that they are prepared to pay for. So
I suppose India and China are different to SA in the fact that they have very large populations, also fairly high growth economies.
Yes.
And also a culture of literacy as well. Do you think that South Africa has that reading interest and appetite?
Actually, you've nailed a very significant chunk of the problem as well, because the culture of literacy is not here. Now, if you take Zimbabwe, for example, the newspapers in Zimbabwe are actually profitable. And I know people kind of raise eyebrows when I say this to them. I did a short blog post when I was in Harare for a brief period, and you literally have street vendors who are selling newspapers, and there's an assortment of newspapers and magazines that are spread out, and people are buying them, and those publications are profitable. Why? Because of the fact that in spite of all of the Mugabe era demagoguery, for the longest time, Zimbabwe has had a fairly solid educational system, which means that the levels of literacy in the country is very high. Because of the fact that people were not able to trust the broadcast media, they generally put their faith into print media, and so it has been able to thrive. But yes, you're absolutely right. It's a large contributing factor. So in South Africa, for example, you just look in terms of there are real cultural differences across communities. So there's a long and established tradition of newspaper reading among the Zulu people, which goes back to the newspaper called Ilanga many years ago, which used to be owned by the Argus Company. And Ilanga is still on sale to this day, but Ilanga was sold to the Inkatha Freedom Party years ago. There's now another newspaper called Isolezwe, and Isolezwe is owned by independent newspapers. And Isolezwe is also a successful publication still in the independent newspaper stable. On the other hand, you've had people try to set up newspapers in the Eastern Cape, and these have fallen flat. They've been completely unsustainable. Why? Because the same tradition in terms of acquiring newspapers on a daily basis never manifested itself in the Eastern Cape. Some years ago, I remember there was a youngster named Becky Mashile who tried to start a newspaper in Nelspruit called the Mpumalanga Times. And it went toes up because it wasn't able to build a sustained basis on it.
And do you think the Afrikaans media is perhaps more durable and robust because that's the primary way in which you as an Afrikaans speaker would be able to get access to information, whereas English language sources are more abundant?
I think that the Afrikaans media landscape is probably one of the more resilient in this country. And again, it's simply because that you've had an asset stripping in terms of state resources around the Afrikaans medium in general. So, Radio Sonogrens is still one of the places at SABC that functions reasonably well. But if you look in terms of the amount of money that has been poured into Afrikaans programming on TV, that to a large extent has shifted gear. And so you've seen a fall off of those audiences going to, the likes of CakeNet and so forth. The print publications have been reasonably solid over the years as well, but they too have seen an overall decline in terms of their readership. And again, that's not surprising because if you consider the ownership structures of basically every media house right now is in some way beholden to some faction of government. And I've touched upon this a couple of times before, but certainly e-media has a history of being very clearly aligned with the Ramaphosa faction, which goes back to the fact that Johnny Copeland was in his own capacity, Johnny Copeland being the chairman of the board of the chief executive of the holding company and chairman of the board of eMedia, was one of the single biggest donators to the Ramaphosa campaign. You've got SABC, obviously, is very firmly in terms of state hands. You've got Naspers is the chief executive of Naspers, used to be chief executive of Cyril Ramaphosa's Shanduka. You have the group that's now printing the Sunday Times. But I forget what they're currently called. But certainly they have Jobo Modeketi's team across out there. If you look at DSTV, the chief executive of MultiChoice Africa is Gwede Mantashe's son-in-law. So across the board, you've been seeing I think an overall sense of people being aware that almost every media house is to some extent or the other compromised. And you see this manifest itself in terms of the way in which Adrian Basson, who runs News 24, is, so firmly up Cyril Ramaphosa's posterior. It's actually quite embarrassing most of the time. So I think the Afrikaans media, increasingly has been. I don't know where the Afrikaans audiences have actually been moving to get additional sources of information. But at the same time, take into account the fact that we have had an overall depletion in the size of the Afrikaans population in this country, based on the fact that there's significant numbers that have been migrating to other parts of the world. And, I think by and large, the language ends up being a kind of casualty of that process, because, if you move to the United States, you're unlikely to be spending significant chunks of time communicating in your mother tongue. I mean, certainly the only time I get to speak Tamil is with my mother these days, because, certainly no one else in my family does.
So what about the issues of credibility of media institutions, particularly the so-called legacy media? I mean, I remember during the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States, there was that scene of that journalist standing before a burning building saying that these were
the mostly peaceful protests.
Peaceful but fiery protests, yeah.
Yes.
So, then I think most people just would have looked at that and been incredulous about why should I believe what this commentator is saying. So, I mean, that's something that's happening across the board. Even BBC, which you mentioned earlier, which was almost like a broadcaster of record, if you will, and had a global reach. I think if you had to cast your eyes over the website of the BBC World these days, you'd get a pretty clear sense of their political leanings. So, can we blame audiences for seeking alternatives when the media houses themselves are sacrificing their own credibility?
No, I think you've answered your own question. You can't blame those audiences. But you see, the interesting thing is that by and large, people know when they are being lied to, and more importantly, they will also then vote with their feet in terms of where they end up watching. I mean, you consider, Joe Rogan as a phenomenon, just single-handedly, where he's pulling audiences of about 11 million people per podcast, versus CNN, pulling something like less than 1 million now for its primetime bulletins. You're talking about 800,000 people who are now tuning in. So I think that that crisis of credibility has led to an overall decline in audience. And one would have thought that there would actually be a sea change that would take place, where people would realize that, well, what we need to do perhaps is to actually reverse direction. But, clearly the vested interests that now have a role to play in terms of these media operations are really difficult to overcome. So, very good example of this is that Fox News, as a case in point, has massive reach. I think it's still the biggest primetime news broadcast in the United States. And in fact, Fox News pulls in a larger audience than all of the other players put together. So you put in CNN, NBC, ABC, CBS, all of them, and Fox News is bigger than all of them. But there are people who will advertise on those other channels who will not advertise on Fox News. And they will not advertise on Fox News because they're afraid of cancel culture. Because and so you get into this self-reinforcing trap where you're not able to get the advertisers on board, where you could then make the money to give to produce a better product, and it's going to be and that's why I like coming back to the newspaper analogy, because you can't stop the individual from putting down their money to actually ensure that that the subscription keeps flowing. Now, the difficulty with taking that business model and translating it into the world that we're in right now, you and I, where we're communicating, basically making use of an internet-based channel, which is eventually going to end up on YouTube, which is all well and good as long as we're able to make use of YouTube as a channel and we don't fall foul of YouTube's own censorship laws. But if on the assumption that we wanted to go it alone and we wanted to essentially stream our own channel, well, the logistics there become quite huge, because consider if you watch Netflix as an example, and I'm just going to get slightly technical here for a second. In order to get a full HD signal, which is a 1920 by 1080 50 times a second stream to your screen, you require roughly a 2 megabit pipeline to come directly through from Netflix through to your computer. So that means that for every single person who is watching Netflix at any given time, Netflix has to pay for a separate 2 megabit pipeline from their servers through to the person who's receiving it. Yes, I know I'm paying a subscription to my service provider to be able to receive the internet, uncapped and so forth. But in order to push your signal out onto the internet as well, you need to be paying for your own pipeline. And the costs for that accumulate very, very quickly. So, if you want to reach audiences of millions on TV, which is really where you need to be in order to be an effective player in the TV space, you're looking literally at costs of millions of rand per day in order to set up that type of digital distribution mechanism. So that makes it really difficult to come up with a business model that would be profitable from the point of view of, running a fully staffed 24/7 news channel, producing all of the content, because the bulk of your money is going to go in terms of your actual distribution. Now, there was a light at the tunnel a couple of decades ago, which was the promise of satellite television. Because the idea behind satellite TV is that you can reach as many people as you want to just based on paying for a single pipeline, which is the model that now gets used by OpenView HD. The problem that we have is that there was an unholy deal that was struck primarily by MultiChoice at the time, to basically force satellite TV to be regulated in South Africa. Now, there's no reason why satellite TV needs to be regulated. The reason why I say this, broadcast does need to be regulated because you're making use of public spectrum frequency, which is a scarce resource. And so you put in place processes for regulating that, and you decide how to best distribute that spectrum in the interests of the people of the country. So, we're now going through the scenario where we're saying spending massive amounts of spectrum on analog television makes no sense to us. And so what we're going to do is we're going to hone all of that down into digital distribution and then use the rest of it for telecommunications. Now, the thing with satellite is that there's no scarce resource that's being used. But because of the fact that there was that deal that was put in place, and it was essentially so that MultiChoice could end up protecting its share of market, because you see multiple players were allowed to come in without TV licenses then pretty much anyone could put up a satellite up there and start broadcasting. By the way, there's nothing that stops people from doing that currently, because on the assumption that you've got dishes that are sufficiently large, you can pick up broadcasts from many parts of the world. One of the things that I went through fairly recently was I got very irritated at the point at which Russia TV was yanked from our airwaves. Not that Russia Today is what I'm talking about. Not that I particularly trust Russia Today. It's just that I get very suspicious at the point at which I'm told I shouldn't be watching something. And it turns out that if you actually do have a dish with a sufficiently low angle, 14 degrees in our case, you can pick up Russia Today directly off their satellites. So anyone, if you're willing to put an additional dish onto your roof and point it low enough on the horizon, you can pick up stuff. But how do we as South Africans turn that into a workable business model for TV without the ability to launch our own satellite? I don't know the answer to that yet.
Well, I think part of the format of the show is that the solutions that we're looking at aren't always immediately self-evident, but it's worth trying to get there. But Kanthan, I think we've spoken quite a lot about media production in this conversation. But what can people who are watching this, who are looking at wanting to become more informed, engaged citizens in a kind of civic sense, how can they go about improving their media consumption habits and sourcing information that is credible and truthful?
It's a great question, and I'll answer it by telling you the type of stuff that I do. I go out of my way to research things from sources that I don't normally have access to. And what that means by and large is that I look for publications in respective countries that are written in the languages of those countries. So, for example, a short while ago, I was researching stuff around the elections that happened in Costa Rica over the weekend. And the quickest way to do it is to actually search for the names of the people that one is looking for. In this case, I was looking for Rodrigo Chavez, who was the new president of Costa Rica as of this weekend. I end up finding lots of Latin American sites. I fire up the Google Chrome browser, and I have the Google Translate extension, which is embedded in the browser. And so I go to a page and I say, translate this page. And then I read through the translation. I do that for Russian media sources. I do that for Ukrainian media sources, for Korean media sources. It is surprisingly effective. And so I try, whenever I come across something that looks slightly dodgy to me. So, basically my rule over the years has been, if CNN and the BBC and Russia Today and China Today and NDTV in India and Fox News have been saying the same thing, then it's probably correct, because they all have diametrically opposed ideological platforms. But if I see something that one of them is reporting and the other is not reporting, I then need to go and individually fact check that in my own capacity. And that means searching for additional sources. And generally, if they're talking about things that are happening in countries where I don't speak the language, that becomes the most effective way of doing it, because we get trapped by our language dependency. So because of the fact that we're predominantly English speaking, that's where the bulk of our media sources end up coming from. And so what that means for us, that almost everything in international news comes from only three sources. We've got AFP, we've got Reuters, and we've got Associated Press. And so you'll end up with a ridiculous situation where both The Guardian and Breitbart News have exactly the same headline and the same body copy, because they've both taken it directly from Reuters or from AFP or from AP. And that's not diversity of information. It's all the same information from the same agencies that gets funneled through to us. So I get into the habit of going to, I check out places like Pravda, even though, some of the stuff that you see out there is quite ludicrous in terms of, the conspiracy theories that abound and that type of thing. But I look at the Korean media, I look at Taiwanese media, and from that, I try and get a sense of whether there's a commonality of conversation that's then allowing me to form an opinion that actually makes sense. And I've been doing that, since the start of this year. I've actually set myself a target that every single day I was going to be writing something fresh, preferably about something that I know nothing about. And so today, for example, just before we got onto this, I'm touching on a handful of important elections that have happened around the world over the past period. So there was elections in Serbia, which saw an entrenchment of a Putin ally. There was the elections in Hungary, which saw the entrenchment of a Putin ally. There was the elections in Costa Rica, which I've just spoken about. There was this attempt to remove the government in Pakistan of Imran Khan, which failed. And it now turns out the reason why it failed is because there was a US attempt to encourage a color revolution there. And these are all things where I've needed to go back to primary sources and try and find out whether people are trying to push a particular agenda. Are there original documents that I can take a look at? All of that type of thing. The Costa Rican president is a very good example, because the piece that immediately popped up from the Wall Street Journal was to say that this guy was fired from the World Bank, where he worked for 30 years, because of sexual harassment. And I eventually had to track my way back down to the internal tribunal at the World Bank, which published the entire finding, where I went down and read through the entire more than 50-page judgment before getting to the conclusion, where they said he acted inappropriately, but it was not sexual harassment. But it requires work, David, and that is the thing about knowledge, that you have to be serious about it, and you have to go into it without any preconceived emotional triggers. And the war in Ukraine right now has really fired up those preconceived emotional triggers, because you have people, because they hate Putin with a passion for whatever reasons, but that ends up being the primary driver in terms of how you end up processing all information. And to my mind, the fact that I have, personally, me in this case, that I have a great deal of trouble with a lot of the things that Putin does, because he has a history of being ruthless in terms of cracking down on all political opposition in his country. But putting all of that aside, it's precisely at those moments that I need to be most careful in terms of filtering out information. Julius Malema being another case in point. I have a profound loathing for Julius Malema. But that is precisely why whenever any information is coming my way about Julius Malema, I go out of my way to make sure that I am independently verifying the information that's coming, just to make sure that I'm not feeding my own prejudices, because I am prejudiced. But how do you train people to get into the mindset of doing that type of thing? Right now, if I put out any material on social media that contradicts any of the narrative around the war of Ukraine, the immediate thing that comes out is, oh, you're a Russian shill. Because the ad hominem attacks become the way in which people end up suppressing real information. And so generally, if you see ad hominem attacks coming out, or if you see hints of information that are not really backed by a legal process that might have taken place. And, again, going back to the Costa Rican president, the thought said, well, if this person was guilty of harassment, well, and the World Bank is certainly not the type of institution that can get away with suppressing things like that, because, the majority of countries in the world are members of the World Bank. They sit on the board, and they actually have a significant say in that type of thing. And it turned out that it was correct. It was, just being led up the garden path by the Wall Street Journal in this particular case. Look, everyone in the world currently does that. And the only way we're going to fix it is if there are enough of us who are doing this. But again, the crucial thing is that, we need to build sources that we can trust for very specific things. Now, I'm not doing the writing to build a source of trust in myself. I'm really doing this to document things that I know to be true for myself. It's an entirely selfish thing that, I'm ending up doing. It just so happens that I share it on a daily basis, because if people end up benefiting from it, well, so be it.
Where do you share it, Kanthan?
On my blog on kanthanpillay.com.
Great. We'll link to that in the description.
Yeah. So there's something new that pops up every day. And as I said, today I'll be touching on those 3 elections, the coup in Pakistan, and let's see where these things go. But it's rough out there. Let me toss the question right back at you. Would you actually pay for credible sources on a daily basis?
Yeah, well, I pay for a few news sources like Politics Web, for example, which I really value. And, I think that it is important to put your money where your mouth is. And if you think of how you drew that example of a cup of coffee,
yes.
People don't think twice about buying a cup of coffee on the way to work. But, I think that there is this, I don't know where it comes from, but this feeling that things on the internet should be free. I do, however, think that that's changing. If you think of, people are now paying to get special subscriptions on YouTube, for example. They pay for web hosting services. Generally, free products tend to sacrifice quality, or you get bombarded with ads and so on. So I do think that culture is shifting somewhat. But, I think it just, as we draw this conversation to a close, Kanthan, could we look at the future of the media and where you see it going over the next 10 years or so? Maybe 10 years is too far a time horizon. But for our viewers who are interested in where the media is heading into the future, what is your view on how the media itself is going to be able to address some of these structural problems that we've spoken about today?
Well, I'm kind of hopeful that technology is going to be part of the solution to some extent. One of the reasons why right now it's really difficult to set up a broadcast TV type network using these things, using our smartphones, is because of the fact that you need that separate pipeline per person. But what is true in the 5G environment is that you have the ability to do what's called multicasting, which basically means that you can send the same information to multiple people on the same network simultaneously. And so what that means is that in the 5G environment, which is going to pretty much become the norm going forward, you are going to be in a position to reach everyone who is on a particular 5G transmitter just for the cost of a single pipeline. So on the assumption, like, let's say if I strike a deal with MTN, where I say that I want to be able to put out a multicast pipeline from every single one of your 5G transmitters around the country. Well, that's immediately giving me a reach that is significantly more affordable than the current business model, which is the Netflix type model, where you pay on a per pipeline. The flip side of that, of course, is that the likes of the telcos are still subject to regulation by government, which means that you're always going to have a bit of an issue that goes with that. But also take in mind that as these costs get, that as these new technologies get developed, you are going to see an increasing shift in terms of other types of existing technology. So I can very well foresee a situation where you have a distributed, decentralized Wi-Fi network where people volunteer to share their own Wi-Fi infrastructure in order for access to things from other parts of the world. Very good example. I consult occasionally for the University of Vienna, which I haven't done for the past couple of years because of COVID. But because of that, I have access to something that's called EduNet, which is basically a Wi-Fi hotspot that's in almost every newspaper, almost every academic institution, major academic institution in the world. So if I happen to be strolling on the Wits University campus, my phone automatically connects through to EduNet, just simply based on the fact that I have my login access from the University of Vienna. So I'd like you to picture that type of model where if you have enough people who say, look, I, in my own capacity, am willing to make my Wi-Fi infrastructure available to myself and to my neighbors, well, within very specific confines, of course. So, you're saying that I'm very happy to take a pipeline of particular programming and forward it at no cost in exchange for receiving it at low cost from up the line. And that would, obviously require people to work on distributed computing systems that are kind of not dissimilar to the way people currently pay in terms of the torrenting space, where you end up essentially sharing content. Right now, it's primarily used for piracy, but the business model is the same. And if you have enough people, a critical mass of people who care enough to share a core level of content, then that removes the cost of distribution for media providers. And it then becomes up to media providers to then be producing content that is going to be powerful enough that people are then going to want to be sharing it. And if they're then able to do that, and if you have a combination of a subscription model and a sharing model, coming out of that, can you potentially end up growing enough of a global hive, shall we say, of independent media producers who can end up being credibility rated through some sort of crowdsourcing initiative. So these are all broad brushstrokes that I've been thinking about for a while, and I'm sure that someone in the venture capitalist space, it's kind of things that Elon Musk churns out on a daily basis, might potentially end up coming up with something that is going to play in that space. But I think that's where I see the future actually going. We're going to be in a particularly dark period for the next while, just simply based on the fact that the amount of rampant censorship that's currently taking place. I don't think George Orwell actually anticipated how accurate his predictions were at the time. Or maybe the business model is that people actually read Orwell and said, hey, this sounds like a great idea, let's do it.
Yeah, I think Orwell's 1984 was a cautionary tale. It was meant to be, but it's not an instruction manual. So I think that's very important to remember.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But Kanthan, Marshall McLuhan once said that the medium is the message. I think that this conversation has really enabled us to really focus on the platforms and the institutions that produce the news and information, and how important that is for us as engaged citizens and people who are wanting to make decisions about how to navigate through the world. So I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think you've helped us to shine light on this critical industry of the media. So thank you very much.
It's an absolute pleasure. And I think, if there's a single thing I hope that comes out of this, is that people actually realize just how interconnected all the technology is. And that's always been the case, because if not for Gutenberg, none of this stuff would have started. If you enjoyed this conversation and you're watching on YouTube, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. That really helps to please the algorithm gods. Also, if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do leave a review there and also share it with your friends and family. My name is David Ansara. This is the Solutions Podcast. Until next time, take care.